Some stories refuse to die, no matter how hard history tries to bury them. For generations, whispers traveled across abandoned plantations, forgotten cemeteries, and quiet southern towns. They spoke of a wealthy plantation owner who committed an act so shocking that newspapers called it madness, politicians called it treason, and neighboring families called it the greatest disgrace the South had ever witnessed. When he died, he left nearly everything he owned, not to his wife, not to his children, not to his wealthy relatives, but to the enslaved man who had served beside him for decades. The decision ignited lawsuits, death threats, and public outrage that echoed long after the Civil War. Some believed it was guilt. Others believed it was love hidden beneath impossible social rules. Still others insisted there was a terrible secret buried somewhere beneath the plantation soil. The truth was more complicated than anyone imagined. To understand why one signature nearly destroyed an entire Southern dynasty, we must return to a time when human lives were measured in dollars, cotton ruled the economy, and mercy itself could be considered a crime. The year was 1858. The Mississippi River carried more than boats and cotton. It carried fortunes. Along its muddy banks stood enormous plantations stretching farther than the eye could see. White-columned mansions overlooked endless rows of cotton, while hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children labored beneath the relentless southern sun. To outsiders, these plantations looked like symbols of prosperity. To those forced to live there, they were prisons without walls. Every sunrise began with the crack of overseers' whips echoing across the fields. Every sunset ended with exhausted bodies returning to cramped cabins, praying that tomorrow would not bring another punishment. Freedom seemed as distant as the stars. Among Mississippi's wealthy landowners lived Jonathan Ashcroft, one of the richest plantation owners in Warren County. His estate covered nearly 3,000 acres. He owned more than 100 enslaved people. His cotton profits reached tens of thousands of dollars each year. Neighbors admired his wealth. Politicians respected his influence. Merchants competed for his business. Yet inside the grand mansion, Jonathan Ashcroft was becoming a lonely man. His wife, Eleanor, had died years earlier from a fever. His only son had left for New Orleans after bitter arguments over business and politics. The enormous house, once filled with laughter and music, had become strangely silent. Only one person remained constantly by Jonathan's side, an enslaved man named Samuel. Samuel had arrived at Ashcroft Plantation as a frightened child barely 10 years old. He had been separated from his mother during a slave auction in Natchez. The memory never left him. He remembered her desperate screams as buyers pulled them apart. He remembered reaching toward her while strangers dragged him away. He remembered promising himself that if he ever survived, he would never forget her face. That promise became the one possession no one could steal. Jonathan first noticed Samuel because the boy never complained. Even after endless days in the fields, Samuel carried himself with quiet dignity. He learned quickly. He remembered everything. Within a few years, Jonathan reassigned him from cotton labor to work inside the mansion. Samuel cleaned fireplaces, maintained account books, prepared horses, delivered letters. Eventually, he became something far more valuable. He became Jonathan's personal assistant. Every morning, Samuel organized business records before breakfast. Every evening, he read newspapers aloud because Jonathan's eyesight slowly began failing. Over the years, Samuel learned to read, write, calculate finances, and even manage negotiations with merchants. Officially, he remained property. In reality, the plantation could barely function without him. The irony was impossible to ignore. The South depended upon enslaved labor while refusing to admit the intelligence and humanity of those performing it. Samuel understood this contradiction better than anyone. He never challenged Jonathan openly. He never raised his voice. Instead, he watched, he listened, he remembered. The years transformed both men. Jonathan's hair turned silver. Samuel grew into a confident, disciplined man respected by nearly everyone on the plantation. Even many white workers quietly admitted Samuel possessed greater judgment than some plantation owners they had met. But respect had limits in the South. No matter how capable Samuel became, the law still considered him property. That painful truth haunted every conversation. One autumn evening, Jonathan collapsed while walking through his cotton warehouse. Doctors arrived before midnight. Their diagnosis frightened everyone. His heart was failing. He might recover, or he might not survive another year. For the first time, Jonathan confronted something wealth could never purchase: time. From his bedroom window, he watched enslaved families returning from the fields. Children laughed despite exhaustion. Mothers carried babies. Old men limped beside teenagers barely old enough to shave. Jonathan found himself staring longest at Samuel, not because Samuel worked harder, but because Samuel seemed to carry invisible burdens no one else noticed. Late one evening, Jonathan asked Samuel an unexpected question. "If tomorrow you were free, what would you do?" Samuel stood silently. Enslaved people learned never to answer questions too quickly. Sometimes curiosity itself became a trap. Finally, he replied quietly, "I would search for my mother." Jonathan looked away. "So many years later?" Samuel nodded. "A son never stops looking." The room became silent except for the crackling fireplace. That simple answer lingered in Jonathan's mind long after Samuel left. Days turned into weeks. Jonathan began asking more questions about Samuel's childhood, about his dreams, about the family auction, about the memories that still haunted him. For perhaps the first time in his life, Jonathan listened not to an enslaved worker, but to another human being. The conversations changed something inside him. He began reviewing plantation records differently. He noticed names instead of inventory, birthdays instead of labor statistics, families instead of financial assets. The transformation was slow, painfully slow, yet impossible to stop. Neighbors soon noticed strange rumors. Jonathan punished overseers who beat enslaved workers without cause. He allowed families to remain together during sales. He reduced impossible cotton quotas after poor harvests. Among wealthy plantation owners, such decisions sparked whispers. Some accused him of growing weak. Others claimed illness had clouded his judgment. His own relatives became increasingly alarmed, especially his younger brother, Charles Ashcroft. Charles believed slavery was not merely profitable, but sacred. He argued that any kindness encouraged rebellion. Whenever he visited the plantation, tension filled every room. One afternoon, Charles watched Samuel reviewing account books inside Jonathan's office. His face hardened. "Why is he handling financial records?" Jonathan answered calmly. "Because he is better at it than anyone else." Charles laughed bitterly. "You trust a slave with your fortune?" Jonathan never looked up from his papers. "I trust honesty more than blood." The sentence struck the room like thunder. Samuel froze. Charles stared in disbelief. Something invisible had shifted, not simply between two brothers, but between an entire generation of Southern values and one man whose conscience had begun asking questions he could no longer silence. Charles left the plantation furious. Within weeks, rumors spread across Warren County. People whispered that Jonathan Ashcroft had lost his mind. Some claimed Samuel had bewitched him. Others insisted illness had softened his judgment. No one imagined the truth, because behind closed doors, Jonathan had quietly summoned an attorney from Jackson, and the document he intended to sign would soon ignite one of the most explosive inheritance battles the South had ever seen. The ink had not yet touched the paper, but history was already beginning to change. The attorney arrived just before sunset. His carriage rolled slowly beneath towering oak trees draped with Spanish moss, while the fading light painted long shadows across the plantation grounds. Men and women returning from the fields paused for a moment, watching the unfamiliar visitor climb the mansion steps. They sensed something unusual was happening, though none of them could have imagined the storm that was about to begin. Jonathan Ashcroft greeted the lawyer without ceremony. His illness had worsened over the winter. Walking across the room left him breathless. His once commanding voice now carried the quiet exhaustion of a man who understood that every sunrise might be his last. Samuel helped him into the study before quietly closing the heavy oak doors. Only 3 men remained inside: Samuel and attorney William Prescott. The lawyer carefully unfolded several sheets of thick parchment. "Mr. Ashcroft," he began cautiously, "I've rewritten the will exactly as you instructed. But before you sign it, I must ask whether these are truly your wishes." Jonathan nodded without hesitation. "They are." Prescott lowered his voice. "You understand that leaving your estate to an enslaved man will almost certainly be challenged. I expect it. The courts may refuse. They may. Your family will fight this." Jonathan looked toward Samuel. "They already have." Silence settled across the room. The lawyer had prepared wills for wealthy families throughout Mississippi. He had witnessed brothers betray brothers over farmland, children sue their own mothers over silverware. But never had he drafted a document like the one now resting on the desk before him. It granted Samuel his immediate freedom upon Jonathan's death. It transferred nearly 2,000 acres of farmland. into a trust managed in Samuel's name. It left him the mansion itself, the livestock, the cotton warehouses, the farming equipment, even Jonathan's treasured library. The only major inheritance reserved elsewhere was a modest financial payment for Jonathan's estranged son. Everything else belonged to Samuel. The lawyer dipped his pen into black ink. "Once signed," he whispered, "there will be no turning back." Jonathan took the pen with trembling fingers. For a long moment, he simply stared at the blank space, waiting for his signature. His thoughts drifted backward through nearly 70 years of life. He remembered buying people as casually as buying horses. He remembered auction blocks where frightened children cried for parents they would never see again. He remembered convincing himself that slavery was simply the natural order of the world because every respectable man around him believed the same. How many lives had he stolen without ever lifting a whip himself? The realization weighed heavier than any illness. Finally, he signed his name, Jonathan Ashcroft. The scratching sound of the pen seemed louder than thunder. History had just shifted. Samuel stood motionless. He had expected Jonathan to grant him freedom someday, perhaps enough money to begin a modest life. But this was unimaginable. He slowly shook his head. "Sir, I cannot accept this." Jonathan smiled faintly. "You already have." Samuel's voice cracked. "It belongs to your family." Jonathan looked directly into his eyes. "My family abandoned me years ago." He paused before continuing. "You remained." Those two words carried decades of shared memories, years of trust, years of quiet loyalty, years during which one man had possessed legal power over another, yet had increasingly come to depend upon him in every way imaginable. Neither spoke again. Outside, the plantation continued as if nothing had changed. Children chased one another between cabins. Women prepared cornbread over open fires. Men repaired broken wagon wheels before darkness fell. None of them knew that inside the mansion, a single signature had quietly challenged the entire foundation of Southern society. But secrets rarely stay buried. Only 5 days later, Jonathan's younger brother Charles learned about the will. His fury erupted instantly. He burst into the mansion without announcing himself. Samuel met him near the front entrance. Charles shoved him aside. "Where is my brother?" Jonathan heard the shouting and slowly entered the hallway. Charles pointed an accusing finger. "Tell me the rumors are false." Jonathan remained calm. "They're true. You've handed generations of Ashcroft property to him?" "I have." Charles's face turned red. "He's your slave," Jonathan answered quietly. "No," Charles frowned. "He has been." The words echoed through the hallway. Several servants froze where they stood. Charles laughed bitterly. "You've gone insane." Jonathan's breathing grew heavier, yet his voice never rose. "I've spent most of my life believing ownership made me superior, and now I know it only made me responsible." Charles slammed his fist against the wall. "Do you realize what people will say?" Jonathan answered without hesitation. "I already know. They'll call our family traitors. Perhaps they'll laugh at our name." Jonathan slowly walked toward the front window. "I deserve worse." Charles stared at his brother as though looking at a complete stranger. The illness had not simply weakened Jonathan's body. It had transformed his conscience. Unable to persuade him, Charles left with a final warning. I'll destroy that will. Jonathan watched his carriage disappear down the long dirt road. I know you'll try, he whispered. Winter gave way to spring. Jonathan rarely left his bedroom. Doctors admitted privately there was little hope. Each day, Samuel managed plantation affairs while spending every evening reading aloud beside Jonathan's bed. Sometimes it was scripture, sometimes